This excerpt is from the University of Georgia's Laboratory of Archaeology Series Number 4. Aboriginal Stone Constructions in the Southern Piedmont. It is not difficult at first glance to describe this construction as a fortification, and indeed there are some superficial features which seem to reinforce this belief. The wall gives the impression of being situated just about where a fort should have been placed, if one were required, in relation to the topography, that is to say, near the relatively narrow saddle which connects the larger mass of the mountain with the summit. Thus the wall would appear to block the passage across the saddle to the higher land, while its ends extend to the rather steep faces of the east and west sides where, presumably, the topography would offer sufficient difficulty to attackers. But closer examination of the supposedly fortress-like qualities of the wall tends to weaken belief in this function. For one thing, the wall is rather low for a defensive construction, and although very possibly it stood somewhat higher in the past, yet the amount of stone remaining in the immediate vicinity of the wall would preclude an original average height of more than 4 or 5 feet. There is no evidence at hand to indicate that it had been made higher by logs or branches, although this is not entirely impossible. A more serious disqualification of this theory is attained by an examination of the form or design of the wall. Curves and zigzags mentioned previously inevitably bring to mind the bastions and salient flanks familiar from European-type fortifications. But it should be strongly emphasized that in nothing but general appearances do these zigzags resemble true fortification techniques. They are not aligned or built with any consistent intention of taking advantage of the contours of the slope. Indeed, in some cases they actually seem to fail to take advantage of potentially strategic contours. In one locality the wall is very poorly situated indeed from the point of view of defense. The eastern third of the construction is on somewhat higher ground than the rest and skirts some very large outcrops of rock, including many loose boulders, and a steep cliff. In the present condition it is quite feasible to use a heavy rock fall as a protection in approaching the fort, by climbing up the rocky slope to the very wall, and in this case the defenders would exposed and the attackers would be covered. The pits, or pillboxes, are often quoted as evidence to support fortress function of the wall, on the assumption that they were used as emplacements for archers or such defenders. This theory can be disposed of fairly quickly. In the first place, the pits are of extremely variable sizes, some being as much as 13 feet wide while others are not large enough to hold a single individual. Second, these pits are not arranged with any eye to defense. The first 180 feet of the wall, on the west side, lacks any pits, whereas in other sections 2 or 3 may be crowded together along 20 or 30 feet of the wall. Third, and most damning of all, there is some very good negative evidence that these pits are very recent construction projects. In an archaeological description of the wall on Fort Mountain published in 1893, careful attention was paid to the shape, composition, and position of the wall and its relationship to the topography, but no mention at all was made of any of the pits or holes which are so noticeable today. There is no reason to doubt the reliability of this description, and although the date of the author's inspection of Fort Mountain is not indicated, it presumably was shortly before 1893. In other words, these supposed emplacements for archers are of quite recent manufacture and were probably made by gold hunters or treasure seekers. This tends to confirm rumors which are occasionally voiced in Chatsworth and the neighboring countryside. Finally, one other deterrent to the fort theory ought to be mentioned: the absence of a water supply inside the wall. This should not be advanced too strongly, perhaps, since the absence of a spring or well at the present time does not exclude the possibility of such a source in the past. But it does remain a fact that today, as far as could be proven, there is no water supply inside the wall. It is perhaps to be doubted that a group of defenders would allow itself to be cornered in such an inhospitable position. The absence of any sort of archaeological remains inside the wall should not be taken too seriously for either side of the argument. The soil is thin and perishable refuse would quickly be destroyed by exposure rather than preserved by chance burial. While the writer has never seen any weapons, tools, or projectile points recovered from the vicinity, these have evidently been found occasionally, for Shackleton, in the article quoted above, mentions finding a few arrowheads inside the wall. These may well have been ordinary hunter's equipment. In any event, even if the construction had been a fort, the absence of any evidence of warfare would be no argument to the contrary. This wall, whatever its function, seems to have been a planned and deliberate undertaking involving considerable time and effort, and not a casual or temporary retreat, yet it was not of course inevitable that it should have suffered an attack. The 3 gateways have been indicated on the attached map by the letters A, B and C. As mentioned before, A, through which the trail to the tower leads, is probably a recent cut, though no positive proof is available concerning it. The writer is unable to offer any real explanations for B and C, possibly they are genuine gaps, and the whales never were connected in these areas, although this seems hardly likely in the case of C where the two walls run parallel to each other for a short length. Possibly, although the writer is inclined to think it unlikely, some careful excavation in the vicinity of B might be rewarding in this respect. Summary regarding the wall. It is easier to say what this wall is not than what it is. Almost all the theories invented to explain its history or origin can be easily disposed of. It obviously did not originate during the war between the states, as is sometimes suggested, since there is a reference to it in a volume published in 1849, and the Moravian missionaries who were in the neighborhood of Spring Place in the early 19th century allegedly observed. There is no evidence, either documentary or archaeological, to support the theory that De Soto or his expedition were responsible. The party does not seem to have passed through this region, nor, in any case, was he having difficulties with the local natives. Certainly, with his equipage of horses and pigs, Fort Mountain would be one of the last places De Soto would visit. In the same way, there seems to be nothing which would support the idea that later Spaniards, or any other Europeans, constructed the wall for defensive purposes. If they had, the writer feels that they would have built it in a quite different manner. The doctrine put forth in some quarters that the wall was built by Prince Madoc of Wales in the 12th century is, it must be emphasized, entirely an unsubstantiated hypothesis. In spite of the vociferations of its followers, it has no reliable basis in archaeological or historical fact. The conviction of the writer, and of Dr. Kelly, is that this wall is of Aboriginal origin, constructed by the prehistoric Indians of the area. This statement, it must be confessed, is based on no very concrete evidence, and probably should be made with a good deal of caution. Almost no work has been done on this kind of problem in American archaeology. In fact, it appears that the investigation of 1955 were the first to be directed to an intensive study of such phenomena, so such conclusions must be taken for what they are worth until more substantial evidence is forthcoming. It is not likely that we will ever be fortunate enough to discover artifacts or archaeological remains in the walls themselves. As mentioned before, 2 sections of the Fort Mountain wall were removed in this connection, without success. They hardly seem the places to deposit such articles as would provide clues. There is a suspicion, and it is no more than that yet, that the stone walls which are found in the southern Appalachians and Piedmont regions of the South may be related in some way to the stone mounds and stone effigies which occur in the same areas. In the mounds and effigies, archaeological remains, skeletal and artifact have occasionally been recovered, and on the meager data we have up to the present time it seems possible that these may belong to what are known as the Archaic and Woodland periods in North American prehistory, perhaps 4,000 to 2,000 years ago. But this, it must be repeated, is still only an hypothesis which will require much more testing and research. It should also be mentioned that the wall on Fort Mountain is not entirely unique in the South, although it is the largest and most impressive found to date. Several other stone walls have been reported, and it is possible that they've all belonged to a very ancient complex which may have been religious or symbolic connotation. While a few of these walls have been mentioned in archaeological literature before, a number of them have come to light as recently as the summer of 1955, and the writer has had the opportunity to inspect most of them. They bear certain things in common. All are of dry stone masonry, although the quality varies greatly. Most of them are built on hilltops or ridges, yet without any ostensible defensive purpose. None of them appears to have any historical background as far as white settlement is concerned. For example, there are the Long Devil's half-acre walls in Putnam County, Georgia, which have well-fitted masonry of unworked stone. The wall near Kensington, Georgia, just south of Chattanooga, Tennessee, reported by Dr. Joseph Johnson in 1955, the stone fort at Manchester, Tennessee, the parallel walls at DeSoto Falls, Alabama, the wall on Ladd Mountain near Cartersville, unfortunately demolished some 20 years ago, the stone wall on Browns Mount near Macon, also demolished recently but described by A. R. Kelly in 1938. L. In addition, there are unexplained lines of stone on Mount Alto, near Rome, Georgia, which seem to resemble the same type. Finally, there is a number of such structures reported from West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee which the writer has not yet had an opportunity of observing but which appear, from the descriptions, to fall into the same general class. The widespread distribution of these phenomena leads to the suspicion on that a common motif, perhaps ceremonial or symbolic, underlies them. Certainly the outline form of the wall on Fort Mountain, with its twisting and curving, bears some resemblance to earth walls in the form of serpents and other shapes found in the Midwestern states, and one is tempted, with no sound evidence or course to suggest that the southern walls were the counterparts or even the progenitors of the northern ones. Whatever the ultimate origin or these constructions, the writer is convinced that the deciding clues will not be found by intensive excavation of individual walls, although some of this might profitably be done where feasible. The proper approach must be a distributional and geographical one, that is, to locate as many as possible of these occurrences, to describe them thoroughly, and to see how, if at all, they compare with each other and whether they can be tied in with other more easily identified archaeological features of the regions. In this respect, it might not be amiss to draw a parallel with a problem in European archaeology which deals with a somewhat similar set of remains and where the approach suggested above has been profitably applied. This is the so-called megalithic problem, dealing with the stone tombs, enclosures, and upright blocks, example Stonehenge in England, which are found all through the Mediterranean, Western European and Baltic regions. Careful studies of these in relation to their occurrences, forms and sometimes contents have given very valuable information concerning the origin, evolution, and spread of these elements and the people who built them, whereas each studied individually would give very little data. Certainly the same approach could be usefully employed on the subject of the stone walls in the south.